Hello, and today we're going to be looking at solving polynomials in factored form. And from the opening problems we did, we kind of found the zero product property, but let's actually formalize it. When we use the zero product property, it's saying this: if I multiply, notice I'm multiplying, if I multiply two numbers and they multiply to zero, then either the first number is 0 or the second number is 0. That's all the zero product property says. You multiply two numbers, you get 0. One of those numbers has to be 0, or both of the numbers could be 0. So that's what I'm going to take a look at polynomials in factored form. I'm multiplying x plus 4 times x plus 1, and I get 0. So that means either x plus 4 equals 0. Try that again. Or x plus 1 equals 0. So then I subtract 4 from both sides. In the first equation, I subtract 1 from both sides in the second equation. And x equals -4 or x equals -1. That's all there is to that problem. I'm just multiplying two numbers, they equal 0. That means each number could be 0. Each parenthesis could be 0. Now you might have noticed that it's just the opposite of what it is in the parentheses, and that's exactly right. It is exactly the opposite of what it is in parentheses, as long as there's no number in front of x. And we'll do a problem where we have a number in front of x later on. But that's all you do with that one. Now, question 3. I want to solve x plus 8, the quantity squared, equals 0. Now, there's a couple of ways I could look at this. The simplest way is x plus 8 times x plus 8 equals 0. Well, that means x plus 8 could be 0. Now, do I need to write both parentheses? No, because they're both exactly the same. I'm going to get the same answer no matter how I do it. I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides, and I'm going to end up with x equals 8. So notice the 8 occurs, -8 that is. Notice the -8 occurs twice, but it's the same number each time. So I only have to write it down once, and that's all I have to do with that problem. Now, if I look at example 5, this is what I was talking about. What happens when there's a number in front of x? Well, I do the same thing. Notice this time multiplying 3 numbers that equal 0. If I multiply 3 numbers that equal 0, really no difference. Each number could be 0. So 3x minus 2 equals 0, or 4x plus 3 equals 0, or x plus 4 equals 0. Let's solve each one of those. So I'm going to add 2 in the first case. And then in the second problem, well, let's do the first problem throughout. So then I'm going to get 3x equals, forgot to put the plus 2 on the other side there. 3x equals 2. Divide both sides by 3. X equals 2/3. Then I go to the second problem. I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides first. So then I'll get 4x equals -3. Divide both sides by 4. X equals -3/4. Finally, go to the last term. I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. And x equals -4. 3 answers. Now notice, just like we said in the first problem, if I look at the third parentheses, it's just the opposite of what I'm doing. So it's x equals -4. Now how do I get the second one? Well, it's the opposite of the number divided by the number in front of x. So you could go straight to x equals -3/4. The opposite of 2 divided by 3, x equals 2/3 is the first one. So when you set them equal to 0, each parentheses equals 0, and you solve each one separately. And that's all you have to do. Now, how can I graph quadratics in factored form by hand? We're pretty much the same way I graph them when they're in standard form. So step one is find the x-intercepts. Now the x-intercepts are your roots, or your solutions when x equals 0. Next, I'm going to find the vertex of the parabola. Now the vertex of the parabola is kind of like I do that the same way I did when it was in standard form, except I'm not going to use the equation x equals negative b over 2a. The axis of symmetry will be the average of the roots. The average of the roots, how do you find the average of two numbers? You add them up and divide by 2. That'll be your axis of symmetry. And then substitute that value to find the y coordinate. Notice we're only doing quadratics on these problems. We're not doing anything else. So it's the same thing as we did do. Step 4, plot the vertex and the roots and draw the parabola. And then step 5, check your answers with technology. So 5 steps to graphing these by hand. Although we can use a calculator to check them. So let's take a look at an example. So I've got x minus 4 times x plus 2. So I'm going to do my problem. X minus 4 times x plus 2 equals 0. So in this case, x equals 4 or x equals negative 2. Because notice x is by themselves, I just do the opposite. Those are my roots. That's the 2 times the parabola is going to cross the x-axis. Now to find the vertex. The axis of symmetry is going to be the average of my roots. The reason I divide by 2 because I'm adding 2 numbers. So 4 plus negative 2 is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to substitute 1 in my equation. So my equation, I got x minus 4 times x plus 2. Remember, that's y equals, because that's a related function. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace x with 1. So x gets 1 minus 4 times 1 plus 2. 1 minus 4 is negative 3. 1 plus 2 is positive 3. So that's y equals negative 9. So my vertex is at 1 and negative 9. So now I'm going to plot my points. So x equals 4. X equals negative 2. And then over 1 and down 9. That's my vertex. Don't draw V, draw a parabola. Because we know a parabola is U-shaped. There we go. Finally, let's check with technology. So what I do is I go to my calculator and I type in the equation x minus 4 times x plus 2. I know when I graphed it by hand I had a standard window, so my window goes from negative 10 to 10, negative 10 to 10 again. So look at my graph, and my graph should look something like what I have on the paper when I sketch it by hand, and that's all we have to do. So once again, type in your equation into y equals, set your window to match the window you graphed by hand, and then press graph to see what it looks like, and it should look like a parabola like we did. And that's all you have to do with those problems. Now if we take a look at number 9 is pretty much the same thing as when we graph it. But notice what we're going to do here. It says an arched garden trellis is modeled by this equation, y equals negative 1.8 parentheses x minus 2 times parentheses x plus 2, with x and y measured in feet. How wide is the arch? Well, if I know here, notice I know my arch opens down because the number in the negative way out in front is negative, so I know the arch opens down. So when I graph this, I know my arch is going to open down. Let's find the x-intercepts. So the x-intercepts would be 0 equals negative 1.8 times x minus 2 times x plus 2. Now notice I'm multiplying three numbers. Does negative 1.8 matter? No, it's just not 0. If I multiply three numbers and the answer is 0, if the first number isn't 0, what does that tell you about the second and third number? The second number could be 0, or the third number could be 0. So when I graph this, I know the graph is going to cross at negative 2 and positive 2. How far apart are those? Well, they're in feet. From negative 2 to positive 2, that's 4. So the width, remember, since it's a word problem, we always answer in a complete sentence, of the trellis is 4 feet. Now, how high is the arch? Well, I know my arch goes something like that, right? Now, I didn't quite draw that right, but that's okay because I'm not asked to graph it. Now I want to find the height of the arch. I can't find the height unless I know the vertex. I got to find this vertex and see if we'll see how close I am. So my vertex, the axis of symmetry, I add up my roots and divide by 2. 2 plus negative 2 divided by 2. Notice that root is 0. I was off a little bit there. So my roof, or my vertex is at 0. So now I'm going to substitute 0 in for x. So 0 equals negative 1.8 times 0 minus 2 times 0 plus 2. Now I'm going to just do a little arithmetic. So I'll get negative 1.8 times negative 2 times positive 2. And that turns out a negative times a negative times a positive. That's a positive answer. 1.8 times 2 times 2. Well, that's the same thing as 1.8 times 4, which is 7.2. So 7.2. So the height of the trellis is 7.2 feet. So if you walk directly underneath this trellis, you'd have to be very tall to hit your head. Although there are people out there who would hit their head on a 7.2 foot trellis. And that's all we have to do in those problems. So it's just solving equations in polynomial form, in factored form. Remember, you set it equal to 0, set each factor equal to 0, and solve. And then if you graph it, we find the roots first, then we find the vertex, and then we plot those 3 points and draw a parabola through them.